Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I'm glad you've joined me today. In this video, I'm going to share using this new Dura-Bright black cardstock, if you will, from Ranger. I'm going to use 4 different colors of alcohol ink as well as the Snow Cap Mixative. It's absolutely necessary to use the white mixative with this because, as you can see, when I drop the alcohol ink colors on the black background, you don't see them. Alcohol inks are transparent, and if we didn't add the white mixative with it, you wouldn't actually see the color to it. So I've got 4 of the colors here that I've mixed or that I've put down, put the white on top of it, and I'm using my alcohol ink blower to move it around. I'm also adding some blending solution just to kind of add some fluid and make it move a little bit more freely. For this particular technique, I'm not interested really in a perfect look to it. I'm trying to get alcohol ink coverage over the surface because for the technique that I'm going to do, you're not really going to see the alcohol ink as a whole once we're done. So I'm going to keep adding some of the alcohol ink as well as the Snow Cap Mixative and the blending solution until I get a coverage that I like for the technique that I'm doing. You can actually take the blending solution and remove some alcohol ink if you found that it's covering a little bit too much or you wanted to thin it out or spread it out. The nice thing with alcohol inks is when you add more blending solution or more alcohol inks, it rehydrates what's underneath and you can get things to flow, move, and blend a little bit more. So you're just going to continue to work until you have the look that you're wanting. The nice thing with alcohol inks as well is they dry fairly quickly. Once you get a really thick amount on there, it does take a little bit longer to dry, but the alcohol ink evaporates fairly quickly. Once my background is completely dried, I'm taking an embossing powder tool and I'm just liberally putting that on my surface. Sometimes thicker areas of alcohol ink can get really, really sticky and it just never dries. So by adding that embossing powder tool to it, I'm taking away the stickiness from those areas. It's going to help the next step with the embossing powder. I'm taking some Versamark ink and I'm stamping my background with the clear ink. And what I'm going to do once I have that background stamped completely, and I'm doing it a couple times just to make sure that I've got some nice good inked image there, is I'm going to add some clear embossing powder. If we hadn't used the embossing powder tool ahead of time, that embossing powder would not only stick to the Versamark ink, but it would also stick to any sticky areas of alcohol ink that have thicker areas or it just didn't dry completely. So by using that embossing powder tool, we can make sure that we get a nice crisp stamped image. I have a container here of clear embossing powder. I'm just putting it on that background, making sure that all of that ink is completely covered. I flick the paper just to take any of the embossing powder away from areas where I don't actually have ink there. Once I've got that done, I'm going to use an embossing tool here and I'm going to melt that powder. Now, the Dura-Lar is plastic, so it's going to warp while I'm embossing it. It is heat resistant, like it can handle a little bit of heat, but I am making sure to move my heat tool around so that I'm not concentrating the heat in one area. And like I said, it does start to warp as I'm heating it, but I did find that once it cooled down, it flattened back out again. So I did check there to make sure that all of the areas were embossed. Because the background is so bright and there's just kind of so much to it, it's hard to see the embossing until you tilt it over and see it in the light. Once the embossing powder is completely embossed, we can move on to our next step, which is spraying the whole surface with some isopropyl alcohol. And then I'm taking some paper towel and I'm lifting up any of the alcohol ink that rehydrates. Now this is why it's called, or I call this technique, trapped alcohol ink, because any of the alcohol ink that's under that embossed image is trapped there. That isopropyl alcohol is not going to get under there. So we're going to get that beautiful plaid background image from the stamp when we rehydrate that alcohol ink and remove it. Now you'll notice that because we did that, the alcohol ink made the embossing fairly dull. So to get that shininess back, I'm just taking my embossing tool and I'm reheating that embossing powder, and it's going to bring the shine back to it. It's a little bit harder to see on screen, but in real life, it's all nice and shiny. I'm going to take my background here and I'm going to cut it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 so that it works perfectly on a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card base. I've got my card base all cut here, and I'm just folding it in the center. I scored it at 4 1/4 and then folded, and I used my Teflon or scoring tool, my Teflon bold folder, to really get a nice crease in there. I did make a black mat to go behind my alcohol stamped background. I just wanted it to show up a little bit more, and it didn't show up as well just on the pink. So by adding the black mat, it just kind of frames it a little bit. It makes it look a lot nicer. I'm going to put that background on there, and I'm going to set that aside to dry. I decided I wanted to make a couple butterflies to go onto the front of the card to decorate it. So I'm using the exact same technique that I used to create my background, but I'm just doing it on one of the scraps that we cut off of the alcohol ink piece when we were making it the size for the card front, sorry. You'll see in a minute when I turn it over to do some die cutting, you'll see the plaid on the background there. You don't need to use a whole lot of alcohol ink here. I'm just trying to get some of those colors from the background, and I made sure to use the pink and the purple because the area that I'm gluing this down on the card is the more bluey green, so it's going to sit out nicely. So my alcohol ink is completely covered here, or sorry, completely dried here. I'm going to put it in the embossing machine, and you may have seen the plaid on the background there. I've got my butterflies. I'm going to glue them to the front of the card using some distressed collage medium. I'm only putting the glue on the body part. I've used my fingers to crease the butterflies just to make those wings pop up a little bit to give this card a little bit more dimension. Once my distressed collage medium is completely dry, I'm taking some black enamel accents, and I'm just putting that on the center of the body. It's just going to make those bodies a different color. It's going to make them black, and the enamel accents has some dimension to it, and it's nice and glossy. So it's going to be really pretty once it's done. I've got a sentiment here that I embossed off screen on black cardstock with white embossing ink. And in order to make it coordinate with the card, I just took those alcohol inks that we were using for the card and colored that embossing powder. Because we've got it embossed on black, you're not going to see the alcohol ink on the cardstock. You're only going to see it on the embossing. I took a little bit of black cardstock, a little scrap, and cut some strips down in order to give this piece a little bit of dimension. Normally I'd use foam pop dots, but as you saw, the foam pop dots that I have are white, and if we use them, you'd see that white underneath, and because there's no white anywhere on the card, it would look a little bit odd. So by using scraps of cardstock, I give that piece a little bit of dimension, but I don't add white to it. So if you look at it on the side, you're going to see black there. And here is the completed finished card. Really a fairly simple design, but I love how it turned out. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a fabulous day.